Welcome everyone. Good morning to those in North America and evening to those in Asia. Um, Today we have the webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on the temporary migrant workers from South and Southeast Asia. And I'm very pleased to introduce a very distinguished panel with us today. We have four speakers, and if I can introduce everyone first. This first speaker is going to be Professor Ahmed Mushfiq Mobarak. He is a professor of economics at Yale University, and he's also the director of the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, and we'll be sharing some of their research on Nepal, Bangladesh, and a few other places. And his blog just went live today, the one that he wrote with Hareen Khan. So I'll share the link to all the blogs also in the chat box in a bit. Next, we have Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne from, she's a research fellow and head of migration and urbanization at the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. And she will be talking about return and reintegration of Sri Lankan migrant workers. Third speaker we have is Dr. Lara Foley, and she's a postdoctoral research fellow at Queen Mary University of London. And she'll be presenting her blog with Professor Nicola Piper, and she's talking about the important issue of wage theft for migrant workers during this pandemic. And lastly, we have Ms. Tatcee Macabuag from Migrant Forum Asia, and Migrant Forum Asia is a regional network of civil society organizations in Asia, and they work on the welfare of migrant workers in different parts of Asia. And she'll be presenting on the role of civil society organizations working for migrant workers in Asia. So before I begin, I wanted to give some housekeeping rules. So each speaker will speak about 5 to 7 minutes, and we will take questions at the chat box at the end. So please feel free to write your questions at any point, and I will take questions from there towards the end of it. So now, without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Mubarak to give his insights on the recent studies they've done on pandemic-related issues for migrant workers.
Thanks very much, Richa and Anna, for the invitation, and I'm also looking forward to what the other panelists have to say, as well as my interaction and questions from the audience. So I will, since I'm going first, I just decided last minute to use some slides to frame what I'm saying about the overall issues with migration. So I just want to show you a few data points as to why I think this topic is important and why we need to pay some special attention to migrant workers in this crisis. So let me, with that, share. So I, with the team at WIRISE, the Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, we, as soon as the crisis hit, we started collecting data and tracking populations, both migrants, non-migrants, and how these families have been experiencing the crisis. And we've done this now in Sierra Leone, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And Nepal and Bangladesh, migration is a much bigger part of the economy. So most of my data, actually almost all of it that I'll talk about with you today, will be focused on South Asia. Okay? And just to give you a context on exactly how this data was collected, so this is what we started. Like, this is just a summary slide on what the various things that we started doing in late March, early April, as the crisis was hitting South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we had existing samples that we'd been studying for many years for other projects. Obviously, it has nothing to do with COVID, but we thought it was a good opportunity for us to keep track of what's happening to these households during the crisis period. So we launched, instead of like the normal in-person data collection, we launched a bunch of sort of high-frequency phone-based tracking of the same population. And it was valuable, as you'll see in some of the graph I'm about to show you, to have baseline information on these families, as well as seasonally variant information on these families, because as we probably all know, migration is a very seasonal phenomenon as well, especially internal migration in countries like India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. Okay? So I'm going to show you data based on these phone tracking, merged with some pre-period data. And we had been running some interventions as well to coordinate with the government on what are the right types of responses that we and interventions that we should be promoting in these populations. Okay? But I won't have time to get into it, so I'm going to skip over that. And let me just, with this graph, show you why I think it's important for us to track what's happening with migrant populations in these countries. So the first thing I want to point out is this is basically the migration rate, the share of populations that rely on migration as a livelihood strategy. Right? Now, using the benchmark in the United States, it's very, very low in the US. So less than 1% of the population is engaged in some kind of migrant work, right, as part of their livelihood strategy. But across the world, in many, many populations that we and others have studied, right, in Nepal, in India, Uganda, Kenya, Ghana, Peru, etc., migration is a significant portion of people's livelihood strategies. This is part of what they do in order to live during the year, right? And so, like, for example, in the Western Terai of Nepal, we see that like 2/3 of households send a migrant in the population that we study. But of course, this is much larger than the national average, which is about 15%. Okay. The reason I'm showing you these two data points is that it also highlights the fact that there are identifiable subpopulations for whom migration is more important. Okay. And that's important because if you want to target any kind of policy response, it is possible for us to figure out, right, who the migrant subpopulations are. Okay? That's one. And the second data point I want to show you is that of this migration from these identifiable subpopulations where 2/3 of households are engaging, in this case, it's rural agricultural households in the Western Terai of Nepal, right? A large portion of that migration is seasonal in nature. Okay? The people don't go, it's not that they're permanently moving away. They're gone for just parts of the year. So again, there are identifiable periods of the year that we have to pay more attention, where people are in the urban area earning an income, and then maybe during harvest, during the festivals in the rural area, they come back. Okay, so with that said, so these are I'm going to show you some data now on these different samples that we've tracked. So there's a sample of refugees and people who live in Rohingya refugee adjacent areas in Bangladesh. There's a set of people who had participated in a visa lottery to Malaysia. So this is about international migration. There's also some internal migration here. So both in Nepal and Bangladesh, we've been studying populations of internal migrants. Okay? All right, so the first thing we've learned from this data is that, so this is now I'm comparing the international migration sample. So these are, so in the red, you have people who back in 2013 had, by luck, won a visa lottery to travel to Malaysia and get a work permit in Malaysia. And gray are people who participated in the lottery and didn't. So I'm starting with this sample because what we call empirical identification is very clean here, right? Which is, it's not that there were some selected group of people who selected into migration. It just so happened that they won a lottery, right? Which is great for inference. And so what we find is that year after year, since 2013 to 2019, as we were tracking these households, year after year, the lottery winners, right, always earn more than lottery losers, which is not surprising. Sometimes, some years, some periods 18% more, some periods actually they double their income. It's not surprising because you have access to a much better labor market in Malaysia, and that allows you to earn more, right? What was surprising is, sorry, my mouse is overacting. What was surprising is that as we interviewed them in April 2020, you saw that the situation had slightly reversed, right? Where for the first time, the migrant households were earning a little bit less than the non-migrant households in some weeks. And so the drop in income was much sharper for migrant households. So this is not only true for this lottery sample. When we look at food insecurity, for example, for internal migrant households in Bangladesh, you also see a large increase in food insecurity among migrant households. When you look at income in Nepal, much sharper drop for migrant households than non-migrant households. And migrant households seem to be disproportionately suffering during this crisis. Okay, and so why is that? I'm again very quickly going through some data. So one reason is that when you look at the subcomponents of income, you look at the detail of income, it turns out the remittance share of income, which is in red now in the graph on the left, the remittance share of income dropped a lot more than non-remittance income. And of course, that disproportionately harms the households that are migrant households that rely more on remittance income. And also, month after month, this is why the baseline data was useful. When we were tracking these households in 2019, the migrant households in Nepal, you see that they're sending back somewhere between 4,000 to 5,000 rupees, right, per month. And then this fell to about 1,700 rupees during the COVID period, after the COVID lockdown, right? So why does remittance share of income go down and remittance go down? One reason is that migrants were forced to return. So basically, especially in Nepal, where a lot of migrants work in India, as soon as India's lockdown happened and the border was closed, a lot of people were forced back. So this is a period where we normally expect many households to have a migrant away, earning an income and bringing the remittance back later. But suddenly, in the first 2 weeks of April, they were forced back home. And that's one reason that they were forced to return. But even, and you see the same pattern returns in northern Bangladesh, right? Like this is what the travel dates look like in a normal year, and here's the return dates in 2020. It's way up above the normal pattern. And the second thing, not only were they forced to return, it's also because those who are still away are actually sending less money back. This is amount of money per migrant away. It drops from about 4,600 rupees in Nepal to about 2,000. Okay. And finally, I'll end with this, which is that now, that a lot of migrants have been forced back. So we started thinking about, okay, what do you do about them? There's two categories of possible responses. The one is that you try to reintegrate them into the local economy. And the other possibility is that you try to repatriate them to the destination where they were, right? So reintegration is normally difficult anyway, because you have a set of workers who work in a different labor market and doesn't necessarily have the skills of the local labor market or the experience. They're also detached from employers in the local labor market, right? So that's normally difficult anyway. But on top of that, something else that we noticed in Bangladesh is that these migrant households were now facing a lot of stigma from the risk of illness. And the stigma was real. We do also see, we've been collecting data on sort of COVID symptoms from March onwards. Whenever migrants return to a community, we do see the reported symptoms of COVID, like the WHO CDC symptoms of COVID going way up, right? So it's a real stigma based on a real risk that the households who live in these villages perceive, right? So that's going to be challenging, and hopefully with the other panelists, we'll start thinking a bit more about the appropriate policy responses. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Mubarak. This is really interesting to understand the household level, impacts of COVID-19, and the data collection you're doing is really valuable for this kind of data sharing, kind of to understand what is happening there. So I'll go next to Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne, who's going to be talking to us about the challenges related to return and reintegration of Sri Lankan migrant workers.
Thank you. Do I come okay? Yes? All right. So thank you, Dr. Shivakoti. And so as we all know, a lot of migrant workers have had to come back, as our previous speaker mentioned. So what happens? How do you bring back such a lot of migrants during a pandemic? And more importantly, what do you do with them? How do you integrate them once they are back? These are huge challenges faced by many of the labor-sending countries in the Southeast Asian or the South Asian region. So Sri Lanka is one of the countries that's really struggling in this return and reintegration process, especially due to the fact that the Sri Lankan borders were closed for like 10 months, right until this morning. Coincidentally, it was this morning that we opened the borders for international flights to come in after 10 months. So until this time, all returns had to be done as government repatriation measures. So people, even if they had lost their job overseas or they wanted to come back, they were not able to come. So there was a huge struggle to come back. So in addition to reintegrating, there was a return issue also in Sri Lanka. So as a result, I feel as if the reintegration measures have taken a second place amidst this whole return and reintegration efforts. However, I would like to say that in terms of reintegrating with a health focus, Sri Lanka has done well. specifically all migrant workers who were repatriated since March of 2020 have had to face this PCR test. And then if they were COVID-19 positive, they were sent to a government funded medical facility for treatment. The others were supposed to go in for a 14-day mandatory quarantine period in a state facility or a paid facility. Thereafter, another 14 days had to be spent at home in quarantine. Even the patients who recovered have to spend another 14 days at home after recovery. So up to that point, this return and reintegration in terms of health happens beautifully. But once they are cleared of COVID-19 issues, they are just left loose and they're kind of finding it very difficult and struggling to reintegrate with the economy or the society. Just as our previous speaker mentioned also, in Sri Lanka also we had a lot of evidence of a new form of xenophobia, some sort of stigmatization of migrant returning, because during the first phase of the pandemic in Sri Lanka also we saw very clear evidence that the caseload in Sri Lanka was driven by returning migrants. So there was some resentment towards them. There was some, negative attitude. So it was challenging psychologically and emotionally as well as socially for these returnees to reintegrate. So, however, there were no activities or policies in place to address these issues. And then let's look at once they come into their family, how can the family help them reintegrate? You know, the family is the first unit that will help you mingle with the society. But then, as we all know, the pandemic had rendered so many people unemployed. So many of the household members who had a job are kind of concerned about their job security, or they have already lost their job. So they are not in the right mental framework to assist or help this returnee to successfully reintegrate. And also they were more conscious about the drop in remittances. I think the previous the speaker also showed that there was a huge drop in remittances. So the households were struggling about, concerned about with the drop in remittance. Now this person has come down, how are we going to cope? So it was not the normal atmosphere that return and reintegration would expect. And then beyond the household, the migrant worker would look at the labor market, the economy. The labor market is also dismal because right now, in the case of Sri Lanka, there's a lot of unemployment due to the pandemic. So the labor market is struggling to find employment for these Sri Lankans who are already in Sri Lanka to find employment opportunities. And on top of that, now we have returning migrant workers. So it's very hard for them to find a new employment and return economically back in the country. So one person that I interviewed, he was doing a very successful job in Oman, and he had to come back in March. So he was like a high-skilled person, but he couldn't find a job for like 9 months in Sri Lanka or find a way of going back to another job. So he was telling that he was feeling kind of depressed and he was very not, feeling down, that there was no scope of finding employment here or overseas. So these are the realities that people are facing. However, now compared to other countries, Sri Lanka has a return and reintegration policy in place, a sub-policy on return and reintegration, which was introduced in 2015. But however, this policy does not provide the necessary tools or the guidance for a situation like the pandemic that we are going through now. So therefore, there is very little hope or very little activities going on in terms of return and reintegration. So Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, which is like the regulatory body for migrant workers, has conducted a survey on returning migrant workers to see what sort of job aspirations they have. So about 23% have mentioned that they would like to find employment in Sri Lanka. And then another 8% have indicated that they would like to start up something new on their own in Sri Lanka. About another 35 had mentioned that they would like to go back. So ironically, in this return and reintegration process now, what is happening is that there's high scope for people finding a job overseas rather than finding a job here right now, because there is very little return and reintegration activities happening to re-employ people in Sri Lanka. There are some plans. As far as I know, these plans have not taken off. So there is a plan to match the skills of returnees with the private sector right now and find them jobs. But as far as I know, it has not taken off. And even there's a plan to provide some in-kind assistance for these startups to get going, but that is also still a plan. So in many ways, it's like at a standstill. Return is happening, but reintegration is not happening successfully. So literature identifies that when there is rapid reintegration, where the system cannot hold, there is a blurring between the line of return and reintegration. So I think this is exactly what is happening in Sri Lanka right now. There is returns more than the Sri Lankan system can handle. And this division between return and reintegration has blurred so much that everybody has started thinking return and reintegration is only bringing them home and forgetting about what shall we do with them afterwards. So it is really important to focus on this reintegration process, because there are a couple of things that we could do. Initially, we can try to find them, help them cope with the situation, and maybe provide some counseling services. If in person is not possible, maybe telecounseling or some sort of activities, and then also help them reclaim their wages or dues that they couldn't when they suddenly had to return back to Sri Lanka. Or else another thing is to make such families eligible for some social security protection, because right now normally migrant families are considered better off and they are not eligible for this social protection coverage. So, and right now they're at a very unlucky place, because they don't have any income coming from overseas, but they are not covered by these protective measures either. So some of the things to consider are these. So finally, I would like to say that if this reintegration component is not focused very clearly, I think the migrant workers returning to Sri Lanka will have to suffer longer than they have to due to the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weeraratne. That was very interesting, and I think reintegration has always been a very difficult challenge for most labor-sending countries. So more support needs to be put in there. So next, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Foley to talk about the important issue of wage theft that Bilesha also kind of mentioned.
So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. My reflections are based on research that Nicola Piper and I are doing to examine how COVID-19 is impacting upon migrant workers, in particular migration corridors, and this forms part of our wider project on unpacking the global governance of labour migration. So the issue that I'm focusing on in my initial comments today is the other pandemic that migrant workers are facing, and that is wage theft. And by this, I mean the intentional underpayment or non-payment of an employee's wages or entitlements by their employer or recruitment agent for work that they have carried out. And I want to flag here that Migrant Forum Asia are key advocates on this issue and a campaign that I will come to. So we know that COVID-19 has had a detrimental impact upon the world of work and the lives of millions of workers worldwide. Some have been compelled to keep working in sectors and workplaces with insufficient safety mechanisms in place, while in other sectors which have been unable to continue their operations and where working from home is not an option, many workers have lost their jobs. And it's clear that migrant workers in particular have been significantly impacted by the pandemic. So many migrants have been let go, while others have been forced to accept poorer terms and conditions of employment. And as movement restrictions and border closures increased between March and May 2020, NGOs, trade unions and other civil society actors began flagging that many employers were letting go of their migrant workforces, and there were increasing reports that some employers were withholding the wages that were owed to their migrant workers. And this issue cuts across different migration corridors, but has been particularly highlighted for workers from South Asia who are employed in the Gulf states, and this is a sizable migration flow. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre noted a substantial increase in the number of allegations of labour abuse between April and August 2020, so an increase of 275% on the previous year. And COVID-19 was cited as a factor in 95% of all of their cases. The most commonly reported labour abuse during this time frame was the non-payment or underpayment of wages, and this was cited in 81% of reported cases. It's important to underline that the issue of wage theft is not new. It's been raised by a number of UN special rapporteurs, by civil society organisations, by trade unions at various global fora for decades, but there's been a historic lack of action to address this injustice. In relation to the global regulatory framework on this, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Workers and Members of Their Families states that when a migrant is forced to return prematurely, such as in this COVID-19 crisis, it states that the person concerned shall have a reasonable opportunity before or after departure to settle any claims for wages and other entitlements due to him or her. And the right to receive a final settlement of wages upon termination of an employment contract is also contained in the International Labour Organization's Protection of Wages Convention and their Migrant Workers Recommendation number 151. But the pandemic appears to have provided many employers with the pretext to retrench their migrant workers and to avoid paying their outstanding wages. And as low-wage migrant workers, I'm talking about the South Asia and Gulf states particularly, they're hired via temporary migration programs where they have employer-tied contracts and their work permits are typically linked to their residential visa. So losing their job invariably will lead to their return or repatriation. So migrant workers had intended to work for the entire period of their contract, earn money, send remittances, pay off debts, and then return to their home countries, ideally after accruing some level of savings. But COVID-19 has resulted in many such workers losing their jobs and forced them to return unexpectedly. And the nature of the returns via the extensive COVID-19 driven repatriation programs that began taking place last summer, and they're still continuing now because workers remain stranded overseas. These repatriation programs also contributed to why wage theft was particularly difficult to challenge, because the affected workers are being put on planes and sent back to their home countries without being given this opportunity to lodge a claim for unpaid wages. And I've touched on this, but I want to emphasize that the reason why wage theft is a particularly grave issue with profound implications for migrant workers is that millions of migrants are returning to situations of debt bondage. So they incurred considerable debts to finance their migration. Moneylenders will seek repayment of these debts. So they will seek that the recruitment fees are repaid, the associated travel costs are repaid. But now these workers have no employment, no money, and no means of getting their unpaid wages from their employers. So spurred by the coinciding issues of COVID-19, wage theft, and the continued lack of global action, a coalition of civil society organizations and trade unions have launched this international campaign which calls on an urgent justice mechanism for repatriated migrant workers, which perhaps Tatcee will touch on as Migrant Forum Asia are one of the leaders. And this is also referred to as the Justice for Wage Theft campaign. And it's calling for a transitional justice mechanism to be put in place to address the wage-related grievances, claims, and labour disputes of the many migrant workers who've been let go due to COVID-19 and who have been repatriated to their countries of origin without being given the chance to lodge a claim for their outstanding wages and other benefits. The campaign launched its first appeal in June 2020, and this fairly quick action was made possible by the existing partnerships and alliances that exist between key civil society organisations and unions at the regional and global level. And many organisations have endorsed this campaign, including the International Trade Union Confederation and Human Rights Watch. So due to this vital campaign and the messaging around it, the issue of wage theft appears to be gaining traction. It's receiving increasing media attention, and the proposal's been made for the International Labour Organization to place wage theft on the agenda for its 2021 annual Congress, and this would lead to a tripartite dialogue on this issue. So just to wrap up, COVID-19 has had a detrimental impact upon the lives of millions of migrant workers, and wage theft is one such harrowing example. The pandemic may provide some impetus for concrete action to rectify wage theft, such as the creation of the aforementioned institutional mechanism through which retrenched and repatriated migrants could make claims for their unpaid wages and other entitlements. For such a global mechanism to become a reality, though, funding would be required in order to process workers' claims and pay out compensation, and where these funds would come from is subject to ongoing discussions. But the most important aspect that is needed to tackle the issue of the non- and underpayment of wages for work carried out is political will, and unfortunately this is still very much lacking. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foley. This is very interesting issue about wage theft. And actually, the next speaker had just put up the website for anyone that is interested on the Justice for Wage Theft campaign, I think. So next, I'll give the floor to Ms. Tatcee from the Migrant Forum in Asia to talk about civil society organizations and how they are supporting migrant workers in Asia.
Hello, good morning, good evening from Manila, where it's 9:30 in the evening for us. Thank you very much for inviting us to this program. Our regional coordinator was originally supposed to um, talk tonight. However, there has been some changes in the schedule of the Global Forum for Migration and Development, and he had to attend that, so I'm speaking on his behalf. So what I will be discussing today, this morning, is the role of civil society in Asia in advocating and working for migrant workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. As already previously mentioned by the speakers before me, migrant workers were among the vulnerable communities that was heavily affected by the pandemic as a result of the health and economic crisis came what we call um, the crisis of rights for many migrant workers. As already mentioned earlier, many were stranded in countries of destination. Many were in situations of distress with not no one to support them as countries went into lockdown. Missions were also overwhelmed with requests for assistance and support. Migrant workers, many who lost their jobs, had also lost their accommodations. Many had very little support in the countries of destination. As Migrant Forum in Asia, we are a regional network of different migrant organizations, civil society, trade unions, and research organizations providing support and assistance for migrant workers in both countries of destination and origin. During the pandemic, MFA members were among the organizations at the forefront of providing support for vulnerable migrant communities. These organizations normally are organizations who are engaged in advocacy, engaged in research, um, had to realign their work to address the gaps and the needs of migrant workers in many communities. CSOs were in the forefront of addressing the issues of migrant workers, addressing the gaps that the governments um, could not address during the pandemic. So, in the first few months of the lockdown, civil society actually mobilized to provide support for those in distress, stranded in countries of destination, from providing meals to those who are stranded, providing shelter for the stranded migrant communities. Uh, excuse me. For many of those affected, um, in many countries of destination, even in countries of origin, civil society also mobilized to help support the returnee migrant workers. A big issue that was already mentioned was the issue of wage theft, mentioned by our previous speakers. Hundreds and thousands of migrant workers came home to um, uh, are victims of wage theft, and very few governments are looking at even documenting these cases or addressing these issues of migrant workers. What civil society did, in line with addressing the issue of wage theft, was first to call on governments to document the hundreds of cases of wage theft among migrant workers, call on the missions to document these cases of wage theft even before migrant workers come home, and upon return to document this while migrants are in quarantine. And this is part of the calls of the Justice for Wage Theft campaign for governments to document and address the issues, and for civil society, both in countries of origin and destination, the MFA members and partners started documenting the cases of migrant workers and help migrant workers file cases against their employers, file cases in different ministries to address this issue. And as already mentioned previously, we launched the campaign also with a big coalition, the Justice for Wage Theft campaign. I posted the website in the chat page, and I hope you can also support the campaign by signing the campaign petition. We are continuing to document the cases of wage theft as more and more migrant workers are sent home. We know that in many countries of origin, very few governments are actually looking into these issues. And with quarantine still in place in many countries, the migrants are unable to report the cases of wage theft and are unable to even go to government ministries to report this, given the quarantine in many countries that are still in place. aside from the wage theft campaign, of course, many of the MFA members provided support and assistance for the returning migrant workers, um, including migrant families. In many countries, these migrant workers are left with a lot of debt upon return, since they were not able to finish their contract. They were not even provided their salaries or end of service benefits upon coming home. Some governments provided support and assistance. For example, the Philippine government provided financial aid for the migrant workers. But for many migrants, it was not easy for them to access this financial assistance because they had to submit a lot of documentation. There's a long process also in order to access the support and assistance. So civil society assisted in connecting the migrant communities, the returnees, and members of their families to avail of this financial assistance upon return to enable the migrant workers to help tide over the migrant workers upon return as they have come home. Um, Another area that needed a lot of support in countries of destination during the pandemic were undocumented and irregular migrant workers. In many countries, despite the pandemic, crackdowns against undocumented migrant workers were continuing. In Southeast Asia, for example, you must have seen this in the news. In Malaysia, crackdowns against undocumented migrant workers and communities were continuing, and migrant workers were detained. Some refugee communities were also detained, and um, the detention centers were very much crowded. There was no social or physical distancing practice in the detention centers. So MFA members and partners also lobbied to stop this detention of undocumented irregular migrant workers in countries of destination. MFA members also mobilized to provide support for the families of undocumented migrant workers, as many of them were afraid to even go to work for fear that they will be detained and caught by the police. So they provided support and assistance, from food aid, food assistance to the migrants, support for the children of these migrant workers who could not go to school, food for the children, even vaccinations for the children of the migrant workers who could not access healthcare facilities, as there are immigration officials in many of these healthcare facilities and hospitals. MFA partners and members also at the beginning of the pandemic played a big role in terms of mobilizing to inform migrant communities about the health precautions, the limitations brought about by the pandemic, as many of the materials that are circulated by the government are in languages that the migrant workers could not understand, in English or in the languages of the countries where the migrant workers are located. So a lot of the work was even just translating all of these documents to the local languages of migrant workers and distributing this information among migrant communities using technology, social media to be able to reach out to the migrant communities, going physically to the migrant labor camps in the Middle East just to provide information about all of this to the migrant communities, and even government directives in terms of the lockdown, as some of the migrants were abandoned by their employers and knew nothing about the situation. Some of the migrants did not know the information or could not access information about the repatriation programs of their government. So a lot of this information, education that could not reach the migrant workers, were done by civil society organizations. Um, Maybe just to summarize in short, since I'm running out of time, a lot of the initiatives of civil society was to address the gaps in terms of the services that governments could not provide, as in many of these countries, migrant workers were excluded in the government initiatives to address the pandemic, both in countries of origin and destination. And civil society had to really lobby very hard in order for governments to see that these communities also need to be included, that the pandemic does not discriminate. It does not look at migrants or nationals or local nationals. It does not discriminate. So there is a need to also address issues of migrant communities, both in countries of destination and origin. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for bringing so many issues together for this talk. I think we don't have too much time for questions, so I'll try to get a few questions together. And I see Professor Mobarak has already started answering a few. So maybe I'll ask Professor Mobarak about Anna's question on how we can disentangle the impact of economic factors from that policy restrictions and regulation factors, or do you feel this is irrelevant? She had a few points, but I'm not going to go there. Also, the issue about irregular channels, I don't remember if you already answered, but maybe in the future, if it is international travel, do you think that is something, even with the restrictions in place, do you think that is something that could happen, migrants leaving through other irregular channels? For Bilesha, I think there was a question on this issue about stigmatization and what has been done because of those issues. And also another question from Sam about the decline in tourism that is happening in Sri Lanka and other places, and how that is making it difficult to reintegrate for workers. And Anna had this question on your reflection on the the connection between return and reintegration and the possibility to remigrate. That is also going to be, I think, migrants are also still going to be looking to remigrate maybe. Sorry, there's questions. There's a question by Nick to Laura and others, and he was asking about this issue about emergency basic income. What do you think of that, as it is advocated by some countries as a basic income given to workers in response to wage theft issue? And lastly, for Tatcee, there was one question on what you're doing to the next steps after collecting and documenting issues related to wage theft, what you were going to do next for that. I'll ask this many questions for now and then give everyone a chance to respond and take a few more questions.
Okay, I can start. Thank you, Anna, for the question. And yes, I think it's going to be always very difficult to disentangle policy change versus the economic factors changing, right? How much of it's employers reacting by wanting people out of their house, how much of it is the government reacting by saying, migrant workers are important vectors of transmission and therefore we want them out. Right? It's impossible to say because all the shocks happen all at once. Now, the one thing I'll point out in terms of enforcing controls, so India, very early in the pandemic had this very strong reaction of saying, okay, we're going to stop all kinds of movements, right? And I think it was just implemented extremely poorly, right? Not thinking carefully about the fact that there were many, many migrant workers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, who live far away from their home, right? And if I stop public transport and if I stop all forms of economic activity, there's no reason for them to stay in the urban area where their families are at home, right? And the families are now newly at risk and there's no way for them to send money back, etc. Right? So that would be an example of exactly what not to do, which is you're trying to react to like a symptom that just appeared without thinking carefully through what people's lives are like, and how they would react to it. That was just, I think it was just like dumb. It was just like not thinking things through carefully and just like a failure, right? Even if they had their heart in the right place. Yeah, and you know what? We don't have much time. Let me leave it at that, and I can always chat with Anna separately.
Laura, maybe next. Is Laura there? Okay. Bilesha, could you answer a few of the questions?
Yes, sure. So let me start off with this, what was done to address this stigma associated with returning migrants. As far as I know, there wasn't anything specific done, and maybe the returnees were more conscious about wearing a mask or following all the quarantine procedures to exhibit that they have stayed inside or stayed careful during the risk period and they are no longer a risk. But other than that, nothing comes to my mind as if any concrete measures were done to address this situation. And then there was another question about decline in tourism and the related decline in employment opportunities in the country. That is very true. The tourism sector was a leading employment generator for the country, and it was hit badly. But fortunately, I was just saying today, as of today, inward flights were open. So there was a pilot project a couple of weeks back where some foreigners were brought into the country, some tourists came. So hopefully the tourism sector will open, where they're planning to have separate hotels dedicated to tourists, and they will stay in those hotels for a specified number of days until they're risk-free before they move around. So with those things, maybe there will be job opportunities coming up in the tourism sector, and hopefully some will be available for these returning migrants. And then Anna had a question about, so let me tell you how it has been before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there had been two types of returning migrants. Some people come back with the intention, no, I am going to go back. I will wait with my family for a couple of months or a year or whatever, because my long-term plan is to do 5-6 trips and accumulate this amount of savings. So I need to go back. So in the interim, while they are here, they might reintegrate very successfully, find a job, or if not, leave or start up something, or be very integrated with the society. And then there's another type of people who would come back thinking, I'm not going to go back, but then their lifestyle has changed so much, it is very difficult for them to reintegrate to the Sri Lankan society once again, because they have come from a different social strata now, and their family was where they left off. So that is kind of a friction sometimes. So when they can't cope with it, some of these people tend to leave again. So I really don't know how things will work out with the pandemic, because there are fewer opportunities to go back or fewer opportunities to find employment here. So sometimes these dynamics would change. So let's wait a little bit more and see what really happens in terms of that.
All right, thank you. Next, maybe Laura, the question about emergency basic income, and also John had another question for you on what role global North countries can play or are playing in this issue about wage theft, especially in global forums. If you could answer that.
Yes. So just to underline that migrant workers are typically remain excluded from accessing social protection provisions in countries of destination. So while states should ideally be providing the same level of assistance and protection that they afford to their nationals, such as unemployment benefits, sick leave, income support, wage subsidies, that is not the case in many, many countries. With regards to emergency basic income for migrant workers, I think it's a really interesting idea. It's not come up in the conversations that we have been having, but perhaps as Tatcee is involved in the Justice for Wage Theft campaign and was involved in many more conversations than we have had, she might be able to shed light on if that has come up. My feeling is, again, it would involve political will. But just with regards to, I alluded to where could funds come from for some sort of, compensation mechanism. So, and again, I don't want to step on anything that Tatcee is going to say, but they've talked about the possibility of, governments, private actors, businesses, philanthropic foundations possibly contributing to a fund. But an alternative proposal that was circulated by the Global Knowledge Partnership of Migration and Development, so NOMAD, at the World Bank, is to create a large-scale concessional financing facility for migration. So this has been proposed, and I've heard Dilip Ratha mentioned a few times, and he's got a paper on it. But it would be a form of public-private partnership between governments and diaspora organizations. So I foresee some potential issues with that, but these are the conversations that we're seeing happening. With regards to states in the global north, there is a need to apply pressure about this issue, but there's something else needed as well, is that more evidence is needed. So there's a need for documentation, and for example, on the Justice for Wage Theft campaign website, there's a way to submit violations. So evidence is needed, but absolutely pressure needs to be applied, because certainly I've not seen it applied, and businesses as well need to absolutely be held accountable, because this is it's a pervasive issue. So yeah, there's a lot more that can and must be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So maybe I know Tatcee has put in some links and answered a few questions, but if you could speak a little bit about what you're doing next about the wage theft issue going forward, and also if you want to talk about the emergency basic income, if that is a solution for the short term, that's a question from Nick.
Thank you very much. I know I've answered some of the questions, but maybe also to respond to the issue of documentation, as was previously mentioned, governments are not really looking at documenting many of these cases, and that is one of our biggest calls to document these cases of wage theft. We in MFA are documenting the cases that are that of the migrants who come to us and request for assistance, but we know that many cases are still not documented, and what we are documenting is just a small fraction of what is a bigger issue and a broader community that has been affected by wage theft. And we will be continuing to with the documentation and also calling actually for governments themselves to document the cases before the migrants are repatriated or upon repatriation during quarantine. And this documentation can support the call for the establishment of an international claims commission that was discussed earlier, and one of the proposals of the campaign. And through this documentation, migrant workers will be able to eventually claim the compensation that they need, that is owed to them. And in terms of the fund, as was already mentioned, there was a proposal already from the World Bank, and I understand in the session right now in the Global Forum on Migration and Development, this is also being mentioned and presented to governments as part of the discussions around non-payment of wages and wage theft. The since I don't have a lot of time to address many of the questions, we do have a statement, an appeal as to how this proposed fund will come about, and I'll put the link to the statement in the chat page. And I understand in terms also of the next steps of the campaign, one of the things that we are looking at is to dialogue with international institutions who can help set up this justice mechanism, the urgent justice mechanism that we are talking about, and for the international organizations to take up this issue. One is to dialogue with the ILO and of course IOM in terms of what role they can play in terms of how this justice mechanism can be set up. We are also continuing to dialogue with individual governments if they can set up at the national level, for example, systems that can address the issue of wage theft among migrant workers. The UAE has already set up a mobile court that migrant workers are able to access. I believe the Philippine government is also trying to set up an online complaints mechanisms as part of the Ministry of Labor so that workers can access this. So we are also trying to communicate to workers that these grievance mechanisms are available for them and to help them report their cases to governments. And of course, we are also using different intergovernmental processes to advocate for this issue, to bring this up in intergovernmental processes. In the GFMD, there was a side event on non-payment of wages organized also just to put this into the attention of governments as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think the speakers today brought, very important issues in light, especially for countries that send large numbers of migrant workers temporarily to work in other countries. For Asia, Gulf countries, other Southeast Asian and East Asian countries are major destinations. And these are big challenges, like issues related to wage theft and non-payment have always been a big challenge, but this pandemic really brought all of the very difficult issues in light. And also the issue about reintegration. It's always been one of the least focused part. The pre-migration and migration part has always been focused for many governments. So it's been a weak link, and I think the pandemic really showed how this really needs to be strengthened going forward for migrant workers who would like to stay back, or if they need to come back because of a big issue like this. So thank you so much for everyone who spoke today and giving us really great insights from your research. I know in the chat there are some links that were shared by Lara White from IOM, and also Tatcee has shared the Justice for Wage Theft link and others. So please have a look. We're 8:59, so I'll close 1 minute early. And thank you again for everyone joining us very early or very late in different parts of the world. We really appreciate it. Thank you.